I'm privileged to moderate a panel tonight with Bishop Paprocki from Illinois. It's a great pleasure to have His Excellency with us. I'm afraid that Bishop Robert Barron could not be with us tonight, but he sends his regrets and hopes his words in the film convey his deep love for Cardinal George. We also have Michel Heinlein, who is a biographer of Cardinal George, and you saw him in the film as Mary Hallan FioRito, and then of course Robert Royal, who needs no introduction. So over to you, Bishop.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here today. I'm Bishop Thomas Paprocki, the Bishop of Springfield in Illinois, and I had the privilege of serving under Cardinal George as his chancellor and as a pastor parish, and then as auxiliary bishop. And first of all, I want to convey to you a message from Cardinal, maybe someday, Bishop Robert Barron, who expressed his regrets that he couldn't be here today. We had a very full day with the bishops' meeting in Baltimore, United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, and he gave a major presentation today on how to evangelize young people, particularly those who are identifying themselves as not being affiliated with the church, and how we can bring them to the church or back to the church. And then he had to be part of a press conference after that, so he expresses his regrets. But as he said, he expressed a lot of what he felt about Cardinal George in the documentary there that you saw. So we're just going to share a few of our own thoughts and reflections, anecdotes, experiences with Cardinal George. We've shown this documentary a few times already, and usually afterwards it requires a little debriefing. You can't just watch it and walk out the door. It takes a little processing, especially for those of us who knew him and worked with him. I had the privilege of serving closely under two cardinals. Chicago, I was appointed Chancellor of the Archdiocese of Chicago in 1992 by the late Joseph Cardinal Bernardine. I served for him until he died. He went through a death also of cancer, went through that experience of his funeral. And then Archbishop Francis George was appointed to Chicago, coming from Portland, Oregon. And so then I served continued to finish out my second term as chancellor, pastor then for a while, then auxiliary bishop under Cardinal George, and served as auxiliary bishop for 7 years. But it was really a great privilege to work for those two cardinals, and I love them both dearly, but they were very different people. Those of us who worked with very different personalities and ways of operating. And in fact, when then Archbishop George was first introduced at the press conference in Chicago when he was named Archbishop of Chicago, there are all kinds of questions about people wanting to know about him and his views on different matters and things like that. And the very last question a reporter asked him said, could you describe in your own words, what is the difference between you and Cardinal Bernardine? And Archbishop George said, well, let me put it this way. Cardinal George was Cardinal George said that Cardinal George said Cardinal Bernardine was a Southern gentleman from South Carolina. I'm a Chicagoan. And all the Chicago reporters knew what that meant. They didn't ask any more questions. That was the end of the press conference, and it just kind of went on from there. I also had the privilege of working closely with Cardinal George and seeing sides of him that he didn't necessarily show to the public that much. It was intriguing to me. Some of the clips in the video brought back lots of memories. Intriguing when I saw that segment with Cardinal Dolan talking about that little green laundry bag. And I didn't know that Cardinal Dolan was going to say that in the video, but so I haven't talked about that, had not shared this with too many people, but I remember it was shortly after Archbishop George was appointed to Chicago. I was serving as chancellor, and we were going to Rome, and I believe it was for his pallium, the little band of cloth that an archbishop wears to indicate that he's the shepherd of province. And so we had arranged to meet at his residence in the afternoon because it was going to be an evening flight to Rome. So I think it was something like 2:30, he said meet me at my residence. So I get there at 2:30, and as I'm arriving, so is he, coming from some last-minute commitments. And so he says, well, come on in, come upstairs, you have to help me pack. And we were supposed to leave at 2:30, so you have to come upstairs, help me pack. Okay, so I go upstairs with him, and he pulls out a suitcase, puts it on his bed, and he's just handing me things to put in the suitcase. And he hands me this tattered green laundry bag. And I said to him, you know, we can get you a nice new laundry bag. And he just, kind of, the way he responded to Cardinal Dolny, he said, I've had that laundry bag since I was first year of the novitiate. He said, it means a lot to me. It has sentimental value. Just put it in the bag. So I did. So, but that was an indication to me of the side of that person. I mean, normally in public you would see that very intellectual, almost coming across as cold sometimes, and not feeling. It was all thinking. And you think, well, this man is having an emotional side. And you saw some of that interplay with reporter Jay Levine, and how Cardinal George said, well, ever since the first interview, you asked me how I feel about things, which reporters like to do. He said, don't ask me how I feel, ask me how I think. And what I think that was for Cardinal George was, in some ways, it was a defense mechanism, because I think he was so intense in his feelings that in a way he just didn't want to show those to people, but they would come out every once in a while. You saw a little snippet of that in the video when he was talking about Pope John Paul II, and he became very emotional just talking about Pope John Paul. And so, yes, I think he was a person, a very, very intelligent person, but also a person of very deep feelings, feelings for other people and concern for other people. And so that brings me to the last point I want to share with you. Another interaction that I had with him is when I was appointed auxiliary bishop. He's the one that called me to let me know that. Oftentimes it's the apostolic nuncio that calls a priest to let him know you're named a bishop. But when I was appointed auxiliary in Chicago and as bishop of Springfield, both times it was Cardinal George that called me and not the nuncio. And I suspect that was his own intervention, perhaps, to tell the nuncio, I want to call on myself and tell him this. And so when I was a pastor at the time when I was being named auxiliary bishop, and the phone rang, and I was actually going out the door, and my secretary says, it's Cardinal George, you might want to take this call. So I go back into my office, and it's Cardinal George, and he says, it was always very direct, right to the point. Oh, good. Hello. Glad I got you on the phone. You're being appointed auxiliary bishop. And I said something like, well, can I have a little time to pray about that? And he said, oh, sure, why don't you go to the chapel and call me back in half an hour? I said, half an hour, maybe a little more time, maybe? But then he was worried I was going to say no. So he starts giving me this little fervorino. He says, well, you know, this is the Pope. This is John Paul II. He's appointing you a bishop. You shouldn't say no to the Pope. And I said, I know. I just need some time to digest this. So I actually arranged then, I was going to actually Mundelein to meet with my spiritual director, so it was good timing. I said, let me meet with my spiritual director. I'll come and see you tomorrow. So I went to the residence, and I accepted the appointment, and I said to, and then he tells me I have to call the nuncio. So I called the nuncio to tell him that I accepted the appointment. But then he starts to give me this little, very fatherly talk on how to be a bishop. And what it boiled down to, the main message was availability. You know, he said, as a bishop, you will have many people asking for your time, and we all tend to be a little protective with our time, but you need to make yourself available. And I'll never forget that lesson, and you'll hear some from some of the other stories. I mean, I'm sure you heard in the documentary how he made himself available. He'd go to things, and he'd be the last person to leave the room, because anybody wanted to talk to him, he would just stand there and be very patient and talk. So those are some of my recollections. I'll ask Mary next. Mary served as the executive secretary to Cardinal George, and has a lot of interactions and stories to share as well.
Thank you very much, Bishop. And as he mentioned, my name is Mary FioRito, and I was Cardinal George's executive assistant for about the last 12 years of his time as Cardinal Archbishop of Chicago. Prior to that, I was Vice Chancellor under Bishop Paprocki, who was then the Chancellor, and then prior to that, I'm an attorney by training. I was the Director of the Pro-Life Office under both Cardinal Bernardine and Cardinal George. So I, like Bishop Paprocki, had an opportunity to work for, as he mentioned, two very different but very good bishops. And so I'm hoping that some of the perspective that I can share tonight will give you an even better and expanded understanding of who Cardinal George was. It reminds me a little bit of when Cardinal George was asked about Pope Benedict. And you remember early on with his election how they would call him Rottweiler and all of these other, the 52 or whatever the German bomber thing is. And the Cardinal was asked about that, about Benedict's public reputation. And I thought his response was very interesting. He said, if you believe the caricature of the man, of course you're going to think something like that. But if you actually knew who he was, you would know that he was a gentleman. He was actually a very shy man, incredibly intellectual and scholarly. Cardinal George would say he's much smarter than I am, Pope Benedict is. He said, but in the United States in particular, with our media culture, we're very, very quick to believe caricatures before we get to know the person. And that's why I'm so grateful to Mike Stark, who's the host and producer of this particular documentary, who's here with us this evening, for really, I think, capturing in an incredible way who Cardinal George was and the many facets of his personality. One particular story I would like to share, because I think it speaks so eloquently to his character, is a conference that he was speaking at. And the Cardinal was a very, very good public speaker. Excellent, very scholarly. He was a teacher by training and at heart and a philosopher. But his strong suit was questions and answers. He really did Q&A sessions like nobody else could. And you could throw almost anything at him and he'd have an amazing, brilliant response that he would come up with. But we were at this session for young leaders, up-and-coming young leaders in the city of Chicago. Father Dan Flens, his pre-secretary, and I had accompanied him to this. And some young 20-something woke guy asked the Cardinal this question. Oh, wait till you hear what he asked him. It says, he's like, social justice warrior type, and he said, my parish priest says that there are two kinds of priests, the ones that want to serve the poor and the ones that want to become bishops. Which one were you? So he goes, and you didn't take it personally. That was the best part of the Cardinal. Like, you could really ask him a pointed question like that, and unless you were being blasphemous, he wouldn't get angry with you. He said, there's a time when I might have asked myself that kind of question. And he said, when I was 13, I made two conscious decisions when I went away to go to St. Henry's in Belleville to become an oblate of Mary Immaculate. And the two conscious decisions I made that day were that I would never come back to Chicago, because the oblates at that point never sent their priests back to their home dioceses, and I would never become a bishop. Because at that point, the Holy See was not making bishops from religious orders. They came from the diocesan priest. He said, so I told God, I know I'll never be a bishop, I'll never be back here in Chicago, and look what happened. So if you put your life in God's hands, he can take you places where you think you'd never go. So I always remember that particular candidness of that response, that he really, when he united his life to the cross, that was one of the great sacrifices he thought he would make, almost, in the Old Testament, Abraham sacrificing his son in a way, that he offered that back. I know I'll never come back here. I don't know that he wanted to be a bishop. I think he really enjoyed being a missionary. But how God took that sacrifice and then turned it into the very thing he said he would give up. So I'll let our other panel, Michel Heinlein, who was the Cardinal's biographer.
I remember being a student here myself, a proud alumnus of this university, and I met Cardinal George my first semester here. And he was somewhat of a legend to me because I grew up in the shadows of Chicago in northwest Indiana, and I was a bit starstruck to meet him. And I thought certainly he wouldn't have much time to speak with me, but he left an impression that has not left me. He acted as if I was the only person in the room. He knew about the little town in northwest Indiana where I grew up, talked about it, talked about the town square. He had some relatives that had lived there that he visited in the summer when he was a boy in Chicago. And we kept in touch through the years, here and there. I wish I would have known him more. But in God's providence, I've gotten to know him more. I'm privileged to be working on a biographical project focusing on really the story of his witness, his discipleship. And I've gotten to know him quite well, I think. I hope that I can tell his story somewhat accurately, because it's a story that needs to be told, as I think that you can see here in this documentary, which really is just wetting our toes in the story of Francis George. When you look at his life, there are many virtues that stick out that I think are very important for all of us as Christians. Particularly, in my mind, stick out that Cardinal George was a man of perseverance. It's interesting that in God's providence, which is a very common theme in all of our lives, God is directing each of us, and you can see in his life the hand of God almost everywhere, and it gives me goosebumps to think about what I've distilled and how I can see God moving in his life. But in God's providence, he was brought to the Oblates of Mary Immaculate, a community he never really heard of when he was 13, but was introduced to them by a classmate, and eventually went to their seminary because Chicago would not ordain him because of his disability. And the Oblates take a fourth vow in addition to poverty, chastity, and obedience. They take a fourth vow of perseverance. And that really defines the man in so many ways. He carried the cross of Christ every day, but he did it with a certain amount of joy that is uncommon. And I think that people can look to Cardinal George as a witness of how to carry the cross in today's world. That perseverance enabled him to also be a model disciple. His motto as a bishop was Christo Gloria in Ecclesia, to Christ be glory in the church. There was nothing about Francis George that was really about Francis George. Everything about him was really about Christ. And his mission in life as a missionary oblate of Mary Immaculate was to lead others to Christ. No one really owned him except Christ the Lord. He would not be owned by anybody because he was so convinced to lead others to the truth that there was not really much subjective about him at all. Another virtue that sticks out in my mind about him is that he had a prophetic voice, and you could see that in some of the clips of the documentary. As president of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops at a very tenuous time in our history, he led the bishops with a united voice to stand up to the Obama administration when they were threatening our religious freedom. He was the only one that could rally the bishops together, and it was quite providential that he was brought into that leadership role at the time he was. He could have been president of the conference years before, because as Archbishop Listecki and others have mentioned, when anyone saw Francis George take to the microphone on the floor of the bishops' conference, everybody was attuned to what he had to say. And so that was a major contribution that he offered to the body of bishops in the United States. Finally, and I think most importantly, Francis George was a pastor, and he was very understated as a pastor. He would be the last person often to leave a parish event, much to the pastor's chagrin. He would stay and talk to anybody. If he was at a fancy fundraising dinner in downtown Chicago at one of the ritzy hotels, he'd be the last to leave because he'd be working his way through the kitchen to talk to the wait staff, some of whom he got to know by name, some of whom he'd speak to in Spanish. He knew his people knew him, and he loved them. He was the first Archbishop of Chicago ever to visit all of the parishes in his archdiocese, which is no small feat. It was over 300 at the time, but he made that a priority because he was meant to give himself in service to his people. In his last public mass, which you saw in the documentary, the homily that he gave, he said, "People are asking me, what is my legacy?" He said, "My legacy is all of you, his flock." If he did something to ensure that we were all answering our call to holiness, he felt that he was accomplishing what the Lord was calling him to do. It might sound simple or trite, perhaps, but it's really the most important thing a bishop can do. And I think that his legacy speaks volumes and will continue to do so But the last thing I will leave is you saw his grave there in the documentary. He opted not to be buried with the archbishops of Chicago in a large mausoleum outside of the city. He opted to be buried in a cemetery out near O'Hare Airport next to his family. And he still has access to his flock. The mausoleum's locked up, it's hard to get into where the other bishops are buried. But he's buried in a public cemetery where people visit. I've been to his grave several times and encountered people there praying to him. And so, he was an alumnus of this university. He loved it very much. He served it on its board of trustees. And I hope that his legacy will continue to live on in many places, but particularly here. And so I'm grateful that you're all here to celebrate him.
Well, my experience is a little bit different than my fellow panelists and the experience of most of the people that you saw in the film. I first got to know Cardinal George personally in 1994 here at Catholic University. The journal Communio had a conference on what we called back then multiculturalism. And I'd done a lot of work. My first book kind of touched on that subject. And he came up to me after I'd given a lecture, which was later published, called Slouching Towards Suburban. It's a reference to W.B. Yeats's poems, Slouching Toward Bethlehem. And we got talking about enculturation of all things. Even back then, I just came back from the Synod in Rome, and enculturation was talked about as if it was discovered yesterday. Meanwhile, Francis George had been doing this for decades and decades, as missionaries have for a number of years. So we exchanged communications, we sent each other articles. I think he was still Bishop of Yakima at that time. And it was only about 15 years ago, 10 or 15 years ago, that we renewed our personal relationship. We'd seen each other a few times, thanks to the Lumen Christi Institute at the University of Chicago. Lumen Christi is a Catholic institute that is affiliated with the university. It's not officially part of the university. And its director, Thomas Levergood, who I wish was here tonight because he would have some interesting things to say, decided that the Cardinal had been putting out these tremendous texts, speeches, essays, homilies, and whatnot. And they were going to be lost, but they needed to be collected into a book or lost. So I was doing some work with him. I live here in Washington. I was going out there almost every week to teach a course for them and to do some other things. And so we met with Cardinal George. And he and I sat down and we figured we'll hammer out some books from all these essays that these speeches and essays that you've given over the course of a number of years. So I got to know his mind very, very well. I was reminded, just looking at this film, that he was, I think, I've known a lot of intellectuals in my life, but I think he's the only intellectual I know who had a big brain and also a big heart, the way you saw it in that film. Now, as an editor with Cardinal George, I think I can reveal some interesting things to you, because to this day, I edit an online series called The Catholic. And what I always try to do as an editor is to get people to say things succinctly, not to go on and on and on. I'm going to disagree a little bit with Joan Lewis because I found out that Cardinal George was never willing to say things in only 50 words. He was very happy to say things in 500 words. I remember, I think it's toward the beginning of the book, God in Action. There's a big chunk of text about Thomas Aquinas in the introduction. I said to him, Your Eminence, look, this kind of puts a roadblock right at the beginning of the book. How are people going to get into this? Well, let's take a big chunk of that and put it as kind of an appendix to that opening chapter. And I gave him what I thought was a brilliant synthesis of what he was trying to say in one paragraph. So I used to go over to the residence. I would stay with him. He went into his study. I was in the other room working on it. And he came back about a half hour later with maybe 3 additional pages to the ones that I tried to cut down to a single paragraph. His mind was constantly working. We would examine every single point in those books, and they've been gone over, the essays have been gone over multiple times by him, but his mind was working constantly to try to reach out and to understand better and to convey to people truths that he thought they needed to know. Now, I find this a characteristic, as we said, right? Persistence is a characteristic of his, but it goes all the way back. One of the other intellectual things about him is you kind of pass over the fact that he studied philosophy, American philosophy, because he wanted to know what American thought was, to be able to better try to inject some Catholicism into it. But very few people know that when he went to Tulane, I guess he was sent down there by the Oblates because they had some kind of operation down there. And he decided as long as he was down there, he'd pursue a PhD in philosophy at Tulane. But the Tulane philosophy department said, a priest can't possibly do philosophy. Catholic priest can't do philosophy. And he was able finally to prevail on them to allow him to study philosophy. But he could not wear his collar in class. That was one of the conditions. And he was willing to make that sacrifice. Obviously, he didn't like it, but he was willing to make that sacrifice because he wanted to know something enough so that he would be able to convey truths to other people. So I see in him this tremendous confluence of the experience that he had as a philosopher, trying to learn about America, and then that practical experience he had traveling around the world with the Oblates and learning about enculturation, because enculturation was an important idea for him. He realized that the modern world was the kind of place where there had to be some very clever approaches to make Christianity accessible again. I want to read just a couple of passages. I pulled these out of the book, The Difference God Makes. The book, The Difference God Makes, is, I think, a brilliant synthesis of all his thought. And as you heard very often in the course of the video, his thought was of one piece with him as a person, the way he interacted with people. When Thomas Levergood asked me to work with the Cardinal on these books, he said, you're going to see, he likes interacting with people. And I said, an intellectual who likes just talking and going. And he was just, the conversation is just never ending. What Bishop Barron said, 2 hours, 2.5 hours after dinner, we would sit around, and sometimes he would have in people from the French Academy or from other parts of the world, and the after-dinner conversations could be quite incredible. But let me just read a couple of passages for you from, I'm going to make this very brief. I didn't have much to do with the Godly Humanism, which was the last book. I'd gone on to some other things by that. But here's an important point. He says in The Difference That God Makes, and he's always talking, by the way, not just about spirituality, not just about a deistic God, but about the triune God, about the Trinitarian God that is a community. G.K. Chesterton, the great, funny, wonderful G.K. Chesterton once said that you read in Genesis that it is not good for man to be alone, which is why God creates Eve. He says, in a way, the Christian idea of the Trinity says that it's not good even for God to be alone. That the ultimate reality is a community. It's a communion. Cardinal George took that extremely seriously and acted in his life in that understanding. He believed himself to be part of a communion that God had created that we're all part of. So he would say that he says this toward the beginning of The Difference God Makes. He pointed out the recent radical individualism in America. He was not unaware, by the way, of the communitarianism that also existed in our frontier history. He says that this radical individualism makes it that the gospel's injunction to surrender oneself to Christ and to others in order to be free has become largely incomprehensible. But the idea that we need other people in order to be who we are, to become free, is becoming incomprehensible. And so the church has a new mission in its evangelization, in its enculturation in the world. Now, he talks a lot about the interpersonal relationship between we human beings and God, and particularly Jesus Christ. But it's never sort of the sentimental and simple Jesus and me, we're friends, that we sometimes hear in the United States. There's always a depth to that understanding of the relationship with Jesus Christ. So he says in the difference God makes. The goal of a new evangelization has to be, I quote here, a deepening of our life with Christ that makes all the difference in the world for us and for the world itself. At the end of the day, when I think back to Cardinal George, several people have talked about how in the end he's kind of a simple man. But I'd leave you with this thought. He's kind of simple in the way that the theologians tell us God is simple, which is to say it's really hard to understand what that simplicity is, because it includes so many different things. He was a man who understood art, he understood music. Funny story, I was in the residence staying over one night, and I'm an obsessive piano player. And so I was playing his grand piano in the residence one night, and he came over and he says, "Oh, that's nice." And I knew that he'd play, and I said, "You still playing?" And he said, "No, I'm sorry to say that my taste is outrun my ability." Typical Francis. So he was a simple man, but a simple man in one of those deep, incomprehensible ways. And I think that's why he will continue to live, perhaps, let us hope, as a saint. But I hope also as an American who tries to wrestle with some of the same questions that he did about how do we inspire our beloved America to be more true to its foundations and to ultimately its role in God's plan. I hope it will also be remembered and read in these books as a guide, as one of the few guides, perhaps the greatest of our bishops and members of the hierarchy here in the United States, to what we really need at this moment in American history to bring us back to ourselves and ultimately to the Lord. Thank you.
Is this working? Oh, perfect. All right, we'll be taking a few questions. I'll come around with the microphone, so just raise your hand and I'll be right over there.
My sister cooked for Cardinal George at the residence from time to time, and she said that he absolutely loved good cuisine, and she delighted in putting together great meals for him. She also mentioned that he was a lover of the Latin Mass, and I'm wondering if anyone on the panel could speak to that or his appreciation for the more ancient form of the liturgy.
Yes, I could talk about that from the perspective of the Society of St. John Cantius, which is a parish on the near north side of Chicago that does Mass both in the ordinary and in the extraordinary form. And it actually started under Cardinal Bernardine, so during the time when I was Chancellor. But when Cardinal George came, he was also very supportive of that community. So we'd started the process, it was actually shortly before Cardinal Bernardine died, like 1996. Cardinal died at the end of that, November of 96. So we just established canonically the canons of St. John Cantius. Now this was a parish on the north side of Chicago that the neighborhood had kind of gone pretty bad, and but there was this priest there, Father Frank Phillips, the resurrectionist, who had this idea for this community that would be not exclusively in the extraordinary form, like the priestly fraternity of St. Peter that does exclusively the extraordinary form, but it would do both, the ordinary and the extraordinary. And I used to, as Chancellor, I used to go there myself once a month, because my canon law studies in Rome were in Latin. So it was one way for me to keep up my Latin and doing that. But when Cardinal George came, he was also very supportive of that community and wanted to see them grow. In fact, he gave them another parish near Mundelein, a smaller, more rural parish, now suburban parish. And so I was with them a few times. He did the ordinations for them at St. John Cantius. But then there was a very interesting thing happening. He was trying to get them to see was sort of like, wanting them to spread their wings and see if they could fly. Because they started out at this one parish, St. John Cantius, and then to this other small parish. And at one point, he asked me, this is not too long before he died, maybe a year and a half before he died. He said to me one day, when I was already bishop in Springfield, he said, what would it take for me to persuade you to send some of the canons of St. John Cantius to Springfield? I said, persuade me. How many do you want to send? So we sent 3, and we've been very blessed with that. But it was his support for that community. In terms of his own celebrating the Mass in Latin, I don't know that I ever experienced that, and I don't know if you came across that in your research. No, he was supportive of it, but I don't think that was part of his own spirituality.
Hello, I'm actually from Chicago, so I'm a great admirer of Cardinal George. My brother actually works for Word on Fire, so I know Bishop Barron personally. I don't know if it was brought up in the presentation, but I know at Mundelein Seminary during Cardinal George's reign, they doubled the amount of priests that was at Mundelein Seminary, so that was kind of cool. Like his new evangelization was actually seen in the city of Chicago. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I think it was probably a combination of Cardinal George's leadership, but also, of course, Bishop Barron being the rector at Mundelein, which drew so many vocations. And as Bishop Barron mentions, Cardinal George really was the spiritual grandfather of that Word on Fire organization, and really gave Bishop Barron the impetus, to create something like that, and he gave him the freedom to do it, which was wonderful, and created the seminary structure in such a way that Bishop Barron was free to do what he did best, and how the administrative tasks were distributed in such a way that it gave Bishop Barron the freedom to do that kind of evangelization work, which then, of course, drew so many bishops became interested in sending their men to Chicago. And then, of course, the Cardinal had a reputation of hiring compelling teachers at Mundelein who were also well-formed. Men, women, religious, lay people, all forming priests there in a way that made bishops from a variety of dioceses very, very happy. So the product grew, if you will. So thank you. That's a very good question.
Any more questions?
I know that Cardinal Bernardine was associated with the consistent ethic of life movement, right? He was involved in formulating it early on. I'm wondering, did Cardinal George carry that forward? I saw in the film he mentions issues related to race, which was so did he carry that forward?
Yeah, he did. So I served as pro-life director under both Cardinal Bernardine and then Cardinal George. I just finished writing an article for Mundelein Seminary's academic journal about sort of the history of the consistent ethic of life. So that's going to be published in a couple of months. So I'll reference, refer you to that in a couple of months when they publish it. But in fact, one of the talks I brought with me tonight, in case the topic would come up, was one that the Cardinal gave here at Catholic University on March 5th of 1999. And it was called In God's Image, Called to Build a Culture of Life. And it was at a conference here at Catholic U. And the Cardinal George obviously believed in what Cardinal Bernardine laid out in the consistent ethic of life. And when we're talking about caricatures, right, I don't think there's any movement in the church that's been so badly misrepresented at times as the consistent ethic of life was. And if you go back and look at Cardinal Bernardine's interviews, there's one that I cite frequently that he did with the National Catholic Register, where he very clearly and specifically says, I don't know how you can subscribe to the consistent ethic and then vote for someone who believes that abortion is a legal right and should remain a legal right. That is not a consistent ethic thing to do. And so Cardinal Bernardine was very clear that the issues were not all equal, but they were linked. And Cardinal George, in this particular talk that he gave at Catholic U, talks about what he called the consistent ethic of solidarity, where the consistent ethic really becomes a way in which we model as a church family solidarity with each other, whether it's solidarity with the unborn, whether that's solidarity with a woman who is facing an unplanned pregnancy. We see John Paul II speak about that beautifully in Crossing the Threshold of Hope, where he says, it is not right to leave the pregnant woman alone. We must stand with her. So you take that kind of solidarity, and he consistently wove it through the different issues. Cardinal George, having come from Yakima and then Portland, very much involved in the assisted suicide debates. And of course, because that's the least churched part of the country, that's where the Hemlock Society started, right, out in Oregon. So he was very much involved in that particular fight, and held the ground there for a while until it became inevitable that it was legalized. But saw that also, right? He talks about that in the video, that in a Catholic hospital, no one's deliberately killed, either at the very beginning of life or at the very end of life. So I would say certainly John Paul II, if you read Evangelium Vitae, at its core, that's a consistent ethic of life message, right? He talks about the death penalty. He talks about poverty. He talks about abortion primarily, because again, issues are not all equal, but they're linked. So you see that in Evangelium Vitae, which of course would be our really the guiding the church's teaching on pro-life issues. I hope that answers your question.
I'm an alum, and I really appreciate everything that you've shared, because I knew very little about Cardinal George. But I see, since you have Jo Lewis here, could she share one or two things about having Cardinal George in her home?
Joe, you want to take the mic first?
The first time I ever met the Cardinal was the very day he became a Cardinal. I stood in a very long line of people to greet him at what the Vatican calls courtesy visits. And when it was my turn, I mentioned, being a native of Chicago. I gave him my name. He asked if he knew a lot of people and places bearing the same name in Chicago. Anyway, so we were talking, and he was seemed to be oblivious that there was anybody else in line. And I said, Your Eminence, really, there's so many people who want to see you and talk to you. And can I just say, hey, the next time you come back to Rome, would you come to my house for dinner? And of course, I realized 5 minutes later what I had just said. Anyway, at that time, we didn't have any emails, but he got in touch via a fax or something and came to Rome for the first time, and one of many, many, many times. And I always asked him to invite whoever he wanted to have at the dinner party, obviously to make him comfortable. Many times it was his auxiliaries or others who were the USCCB when they would come to Rome for a meeting. But I have to tell you, I learned he loved ice cream, and he particularly loved chocolate ice cream. So the first, or second or third time he came to my house for dinner, I made my own chocolate ice cream. And I learned that through friends of his, it could have even been Father Dan, I learned that 2 of my meals were his absolute favorite meals. Because he'd go back to Chicago and tell people, do you know how to make this? And so it was very wonderful. But the conversation, you'd have 10 videos, like tonight's documentary, if I had just simply put a video cam on the table. But he was warm, wonderful, funny, down to earth, a wonderful listener, as well as a wonderful storyteller.
One word, Joan.
Wow.
All right, well, if there's no more questions, before I hand things back to Dr. Pecknold, I'd like to mention that you can get your very own copy of this fantastic film with Mr. Stark over here for $20. Just see him anytime afterwards. I'm sure he also has a website that you can find it at.
No, I don't.
Oh, never mind.
Royal, you should know who he is. Sorry.
Yeah, well, be sure to just come up to him after the event. we'll hand things back to Dr. Pecknold.
Join me in thanking our panel, and I think it would also be appropriate for our evenings to end with a prayer. So join me in welcoming our panel, and then we'll have Father come up and say a prayer for us.
As always, we begin in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. All powerful God, Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, we praise you in your providence for bringing us together, for sending your Holy Spirit into our minds and hearts to help us remember with joy, respect, and gratitude your faithful servant, Francis Cardinal George, Oblate of Mary Immaculate. We happily recall how he sought to give you glory in the Church as a son, brother, priest, and bishop. As an attentive and compassionate pastor, Cardinal George cared for those you entrusted to his care, his family and friends, his brother oblates, the laity and clergy of Yakima, Portland, Chicago, and so many other places that he visited. As a wise, faithful, and clear teacher, he formed men and women in living as disciples of your Son, and stood up for the freedom of all to do so, especially the most vulnerable. By his concern for the reverent and beautiful celebration of the liturgy, he led us more deeply into the life of your grace and inspired us to thirst for the everlasting life of glory that your Son won for us by his death and resurrection. Through the intercession of the Blessed Virgin Mary, help each of us in our different vocations to offer our lives as an oblation to you. In your mercy, receive Cardinal George into the fullness of heavenly glory, so that, if it be your will, your Church may someday not only remember his courageous life, but also benefit from his intercession as one of your holy ones. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Thank you for joining in this presentation this evening. God bless you, and have a safe trip home.